All right, we have mentioned that there are lots of different kinds of books, all right? There are such things as novels, and there are fiction, and there's nonfiction, and there's reference books, and there's history books, and there's books of poetry, all kinds of different kinds of books. In fact, here's a couple kinds right here. I actually read Moby Dick in college, all the way through. First time I read a big book. Understood it, got an A on the test. I was so proud. But has anybody in here ever read the phone book? All right, probably not, because number one, they don't have them anymore. But when I was a kid, the phone book for this area was about that thick, and you probably remember seeing one or whatever. And what would you use it for? What would you use a phone book for? Would you use it for like light reading? What do you do with it?
Find houses or jobs.
You look something up, right? Whether it's finding a phone number or, like you said, find a business or whatever. Moby Dick is read very differently than a phone book is. It's a story. A phone book is simply used to look up information that we might need. A novel, on the other hand, like Moby Dick, uses symbols and literary structures and literary devices to make some kind of point. There's no point to the phone book, all right? There's no theme there. The question I'm going to be talking about today is, what kind of book is the Bible? The Bible, I think, is too often treated like the phone book, like a reference book. But that's not how it was intended to be read, right? Too often what we have is, we want to find out something about baptism, or about love, or about something else. So we go to a concordance, and we look up that word, and we find all the scriptures on that word, and then we draw a conclusion based on just those scriptures. It's not the way to do it. It'd be kind of like going to Moby Dick and looking up all the places where the word whale is used, and then draw conclusions about whales. Doesn't work that way, does it? Unless it's an actual reference book that you're supposed to look up. But the Bible is not a reference book. What is it? Starts with an F, ends with a Tory. It's a story. The Bible is a story. And we need to read it that way. A good book has a subject, it has a main theme, and it has an intended purpose. Have you ever read Moby Dick? Any of you guys?
Wanted to.
Yeah, it's a good book, okay? I encourage reading it sometime. Moby Dick's subject is the whaling industry, but its main theme has to do with the destruction of nature and the obsession and revenge of man. And it has other themes like man versus nature and fate versus free will and some other things. There's quite a bit going on in the book. Herman Melville, the guy that wrote it, weaves this story, and as he does, he uses his characters and the events that he talks about to try to get the reader to understand his deep meaning. If we only used Moby Dick like the phone book, we would miss that, miss what the author's trying to tell us about. The same is true of the Bible. Too often the Bible is presented and it's read and it's studied as if it is like a seemingly disjointed set of books, all right? And I've showed you this slide before. This kind of picture, or at least people telling about this kind of picture, is meant to figure out, all right, we want to learn history, so we go back to that part, or we go up to, where's it at? Kings and Chronicles, etc. If we want to know something about poetry, we go here. If we want to go something about prophecy, we go here, all right? And we're taught too often that that's the way to study the Bible. True, it's written by different authors at different times with each book having its own set of criteria, but it's a part of a whole. That's what we miss. The Bible is made up of history and prophecy and poetry and letters. But if we only study the Bible using this set of criteria as individual books, then we will never see the big picture of what's going on in the book, nor will we understand the beautiful story that the author intended the reader to hear. In this manner, we use the Bible. If we do it this way, we only look at it and teach it that way, then what we're doing is only proving something that we already believe. We think something about love, or we think something about this, or we think about something like that. We go to the concordance, we look up all the verses, we draw a conclusion that too often proves our point instead of sees what God's point of view is in his story. We have to read it and learn it as a very long, true story. This I showed you before also, and we may talk about this again at another time. This is the story, all right? And it's complex. There's a lot going on. It's a long story. We talked about the Bible at one point, very briefly, of the Bible being like a 3-act play. And there's different parts of a 3-act play. There is the beginning, which is the setup. There is plot point 1. There is the middle, which is the confrontation. There is plot point 2, and then there's a resolution at the end. Most, and I say most, stories have some kind of progression like this. The beginning, things are real good. Plot point 2, something or somebody changes that situation into something that's not so good, which is where the confrontation part comes from. That's the most of the story. And then something else changes things back at the end, and there's a resolution. And often in this resolution part, things are actually better there than they were in the beginning. Think about a movie, a book that you've read, a movie that you watched. This is probably in there. So, we said before with something simple like Cinderella, life is good with Dad at the beginning, but then Dad marries a stepmom and Dad dies. That's a turning point. The turning point takes things from good to bad, and then life is cruel for Cinderella. She's under the thumb of her stepmom and her ugly sisters. But what happens here at plot point 2? We have the entering of another character that begins to change things back to the good. And in the end, are things good again? But they are actually better than they were back with Dad. Okay, she's found her soulmate. She's living in the palace. And these three characters over here get their just desserts.
Actually, the funnier thing is that they actually made 2 more versions of that.
Yeah.
So there's Cinderella 2 and 3. I actually have them.
I've never did know that.
Mm-hmm. The mother and the sister and then frogs.
Huh. So it's even worse than I thought. Or better than I thought, I guess. So, yeah. Look here. All of these follow that same plot. And I could put zillions of them up there. All right, but I tried to put some up there that some of you might remember. This pattern is in most stories, movies, TV shows, etc. Is this true of the Bible? Okay, and we're going to see that it is, and then we're going to look at one thing that's very specific in the Bible about this. So, another thing that a good story has is a subject, a main theme, and almost like a one-sentence structure about what the story's about that you can say in one sentence. Any idea what the subject of the Bible is about? And be careful, because most people think they know, and I think they get it wrong, according to what I think. I could be wrong, but I don't know that I am. What's the Bible's subject? You have any idea? What do you think?
Let's say Jesus.
No,
Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Close relation, but I think the Bible, the subject is God.
Okay.
What happens throughout the Bible? We see God being defined in all kinds of ways, so that mankind will know who God was, since they didn't know by the time the Bible was written. Okay, by 1500 BC, no one had any idea who God was, except for very few, like Abraham. Right? And then Moses really didn't even know. He kind of knew, but he didn't really know until God revealed himself to him. So throughout the Bible, what we have is these different major revealing points that God did to some people. And along the way, I got a class about this too, and actually a pretty cool short video that does a real good job of this. He uses different terminologies to define himself all the way through, and they become minor themes, basically. All right? So, yes, I believe that the subject of the Bible is God, but the main theme of the Bible is the seed. That's the main theme. All right? So, we have God as the subject. We have the Son, or what's this mysterious seed at the beginning, as the main theme. And then the Bible is simply about the long, true story of how a holy and righteous God can once again dwell with his unholy and unrighteous people. That's what the story's about. That's the part we're supposed to be able to see. It does this starting in the early parts of Genesis, and it increasingly gives hints and clues in this forms of types and symbols that slowly and methodically point out who that mysterious seed is. To do this, the Bible also uses what I would consider to be a three-part, three-act play. All right? We look at Genesis as a book of Genesis and Revelation as a book of Revelation, but we don't see the commonalities between the two. And there are lots, right? We don't see the story in between, starting at Genesis chapter 3 all the way up until the death of Jesus as being the conflict part. But the whole Bible in the Old Testament up until Jesus, starting in Genesis chapter 3, is the conflict, the confrontation part of the story. What we have in the beginning is everything is really good. Genesis 1 and 2. But then that character comes in that changes things, and things become bad. And there's a struggle all the way through the rest of the Old Testament. If you look at it as one big book, not as individual books. When we get to the middle after that, things are not good anymore, and it begins with crushings and punishments, and we're going to talk about this part today quite a little bit. But then, when we get to this part right here, the life, death, and Jesus' resurrection, we find that that is another turning point, and ultimately, starting in Acts chapter 3, we've got the beginning of the resolution until we get to the end of the book, in which we see Genesis chapters 1 and 2 mirrored in Revelation, the last two chapters. Again, there's tree of life in both places. Again, there's water running through the midst of where they live. Plenty of fruit on the beautiful trees to eat, etc., etc., etc. There's so many parallels between Genesis chapter 1 and 2, specifically chapter 2, and the last two chapters of the book of Revelation. It's like bookends on one book. I hope you're going to see, as I go through this part in another week or so after this, that what I'm trying to show is that this, in and of itself, is evidence that this book was not written by one or 40 different human beings that didn't know what they were doing. This was written by one mastermind to get all of this in there. All right? We're going to talk about one specific thing today here in just a couple of minutes. But here's the thing. We got this three-part storyline in one book, but instead of being rewritten like most books in one man's lifetime, the book was written in the course of 1,500 years and covers all of the thousands of years of human history. This one big story is found in Genesis all the way to Revelation, and even though it is a story utilizing symbols and themes, its characters are real. We're not talking about actors or people that were made up in a story. This is real people's lives going on. While the story is written, it's written about them, and it's got a theme. Who can do that? 66 different books, 1,500 years, all of human history, and yet all use the same subject, all use the same theme, and all have the same intended purpose. That's amazing. How could this happen, especially since all of the characters and the events lived while it was happening in real-time history with no director cuts? There was no do-overs. I don't think most people ever think of that. The story begins at the beginning of time. There's a man and a woman in a place that's a beautiful garden to dwell in peace with their Creator. The Creator offers them everything that they need to thrive and to succeed. They have a purpose, have dominion. They have minerals and gold and silver, all the precious metals they could possibly want. They're actually mentioned in there. Animals and birds all have to do with their taking care of the earth. Water is important. And they have the glories of the universe to look at. That's mentioned specifically in a couple of places in the first couple of chapters. Plus, they can eat from any tree that they want with the best food because it's very good. There is even one tree which, if they eat, will give them life. But there's one caution, one rule to live by. Do not eat from the tree in the midst of the garden. If you do, you'll die. Seems like a minor thing, right? When everything else is so good. This is where the plot changes. They are tempted by a sinister character who tells them that if you eat, you will not die. Now, who to believe? The Creator or the created? God or the serpent? We know from the story that they make the wrong choice. There is, at that point, rebellion, and they side with the created rather than the Creator. Therefore, the consequences are clear. The serpent becomes one who is worshipped. Death becomes the new norm. The tree that gave life is gone. The entrance to the garden is closed up and guarded. And there is separation between the original Creator and his creatures, his images. All seems hopeless and lost. All right? We are at that point right there. And we are going to go through a long time of this part of the plot right here, from that point on. But before I get into that anymore, I want to talk about a literary device that I think is important. It's important to a lot of the books that we read, etc. nowadays. And it's important, I believe, to the Bible. This is a man named Anton Chekhov. He's a Russian playwright. He lived from 1860 to 1904. He wrote several hundred short stories and many plays. Two of his most famous plays are called Three Sisters and The Cherry Orchard. I was in New York. Patty and I were in New York one time. We actually got to see his play, The Cherry Orchard. It was kind of interesting to be able to do that. But Chekhov is actually known for another famous statement that he made about a literary device used by stories of all kinds. It has become known as Chekhov's gun. Now, it states like this. This is, I think, pretty close to his statement. I looked it up online, and there's some various deviations from it, but this is basically it. It says, if in Act 1 you have a rifle hanging on the wall, then at some point in the story it must be fired. Now, over the centuries, since he said that, roughly, a Chekhov's gun does not have to be a gun. And I'm going to give you a few examples so that you know what I'm talking about. But it is a metaphor for a very specific kind of foreshadowing. It is a seemingly unimportant object that is displayed or done or acted out in the first act of a play or a movie or a book. Then it must be what's called fired or used in some way before the end. Otherwise, it's worthless information and it should have never been in there in the first place. So, when a Chekhov's gun is introduced in the story, it forms an expectation with an astute audience or reader. This element must be used in a meaningful way before the last act or before the end. So, how many have ever seen Die Hard? Right? Ever seen Die Hard? Okay, good. I picked a good one. In the first one, the original Die Hard movie, John McClane, who of course is Bruce Willis, has a heart-to-heart talk when he's up in the Nagasaki building, or whatever that building was called, with the policeman on the ground, Sergeant Al Powell, who was actually the guy that was from Family Matters, that Urkel show from years ago. And during the conversation, Officer Powell tells McClane that he has never drawn his gun in active duty since he accidentally killed a kid back when he was a rookie. Remember that statement? Why was that in there? There had to be a reason. I mean, it's just like this casual conversation, just throwing out meaningful stuff. Authors don't work that way. So it's not. It seems like a simple heart-to-heart conversation at the beginning, but later in at the climax of the film, when one of the bad guys named Carl has been arrested, he manages to whip out an automatic weapon from under a blanket and is about to shoot McClane when, out of nowhere, the camera refocuses on who? Boom! He shoots his gun. That fact that he has never shot his gun since he killed the kid is a Chekhov's gun in the story, because it is the very thing, the idea that it would happen sometime in the future is what resolves at the very end one of the major problems, and that was that one guy still being alive. Here's another one. You ever watched Monk? I don't particularly like Monk, all right, but there's some good Chekhov's guns in there. This one is an episode that I'm talking about called Big Reward. Monk continually makes a point of reminding the police station's janitor to clean under the tables. Clean under the tables, clean under the tables. When you think about it, it's just Monk being Monk. He's sanitary, he's anal, all right? But as it turns out, the lost $1 million diamond was hidden in an interrogation room, stuck underneath the table by a wad of gum. So in the very end, the cleaning lady finds the diamond and Monk solves the crime. In this case, the Chekhov's gun is the sanitary habits of Monk. All right? They give you that hint all the way through, but you don't know to the end what it is. So a Chekhov's gun does not have to be a gun. In Superman 2, anybody ever seen that? Good. Lois Lane drops a piece of kryptonite when she's at Superman's man cave. He wants to marry her, so what does he do? He actually comes back and has the whole cave destroyed. It falls down. He's a normal person, but as the movie continues, there are some really, really, really bad problems. And he wishes he was Superman again. And he goes back to that same place where the cave was, up in the middle of the snowstorm, wondering what he can do. It's all this, and then he looks down, and what does he find? He finds that piece of kryptonite that Lois Lane dropped in Act 1. Right? Chekhov's gun. Because he was able to use that to become Superman again and save the world. Right? You see how Chekhov's guns work? There's him finding that kryptonite. Now, anybody ever seen The Fifth Sense? I'm sorry, The Fifth Element with Bruce Willis. It's a futuristic tale about saving the world. All right, well, it doesn't matter. There's a Chekhov's gun, and I'm going to show you about 2 or 3 short scenes that are distributed through that movie. And I want you to see whether or not you can figure out what the Chekhov's gun is by the limited amount of information and not watching the whole movie. All right, here it goes. Yeah, no, we're going to turn that up because you can't hear it. All right, listen close.
You know how my poor wife's feeling, you have to take me on this trip.
Oh, what are you talking about?
Oh, like, you want to make your own other bags?
No, I don't want to make you beg. All I want is an explanation. Look, I just got in. I just smashed my cab. I lost my job. I got mugged. Besides that, everything's peachy. Thanks for asking. Now, we just settle down and explain this to me calmly.
Oh, so you don't know you want a trip to Flustered Paradise for 10 days. And I suppose you're just going to leave me on the lunar surface.
If I don't want a trip, I know about it. Somebody would have notified me.
Foreman, you've been blaring your name on the radio for the last hour, you big ape.
I'll call you back.
Now, nothing more is said about the matches until later on. Now they're trying to save the world.
Should be fine. You're the most scared, yes. Forward, start to go around. Fifth element should be in the middle, and then the weapon and Steven's sugar. You've seen this work before, you know? The weapon has a man. Sure says one too. It's a little bit. Go. Wait. You're the DJ, man. So what happens now? So you have to do that. Right? Theoretically, you know. Part of gonna make you. Corbin, you moved. Did you? Sure, you did. All right, I was just standing here like this, okay, and I put my hands on the top like this, and I said, we're not gonna make it. That's it. Yeah. Should we lost? We can take us to water for water, fire for fire, earth for earth. Go now. First, what we live back.
What's the Chekhov's gun? Get the idea? This is a futuristic story. Nobody uses matches. He used matches. They wouldn't work throughout the movie before because he either they wouldn't light or they wouldn't um, uh, burn his finger or whatever. So he's got one left. That becomes what saves the world. Is there a Chekhov's gun in the Bible? In God's story? This is an important question. I have some smirks and some faces like maybe I know. I won't ask you. Let's just go through and look at some possibilities here. When God questions Adam and Eve, he starts with the man, then he questions the woman. This is the chiastic structure of that particular part of Genesis chapter 3, 9 through 19. Look what's in the center. I know that most of you don't really fully understand what a chiastic structure is. They're found all over the Bible. And the first part of the structure and the last part are very, very much the same. The next two coming in from the bottom and top are the same. And then always in the middle is the point, the main point of whatever that is being, that which is being said or taught or described at that time. Look what's at the center, right? In the chiastic structure to see what it's about. So what we see is that after man and woman rebel, God interrogates the man and then he interrogates the woman. But when God dishes out punishments and condemnation, he begins with the serpent. Notice that the curse is given to the serpent and it's at the center of the chiasm. A center of a chiasm is a very important place. It's the thing that has the main focus. And it is this serpent's punishment that is somehow linked with a woman. In fact, it says in Genesis chapter 3, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. What is God talking about? Who is the seed? What is the bruising? Or in Hebrew, the word is crushing. And a casual reading often glosses over this, and it seems like it's unimportant. But there's a seed that's obviously important. But why? This statement is God's Chekhov gun being placed on the table. It's being loaded. In Genesis chapter 3:15, the gun is loaded. It is being introduced early in God's story, and the reader does not know why it is important, but it must be, by necessity, be fired at some point later in the story, or it is worthless information and should never have been introduced in the first place. Remember that a Chekhov's gun is a prop, a character, an action that seems meaningless at the stage where it's introduced. But it is significant. It is so significant that most often it is the major part of the solution to the proposed problem, and therefore it aids in the resolution of the that comes in Act 3 at the end. Like the bullet shot from an otherwise unfired gun, or a single match that saves the planet, or a peek underneath a dirty table. All right? That's what this is kind of like. But God's historical drama, it is the seed of woman, Eve, that will ultimately conquer and crush the serpent. That's what that's talking about. The conflict or enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And by the end of the story, there will only be one of these two seeds standing, so to speak. It is a prediction or a foreshadowing that seems to tell us that the seed of the woman will ultimately win, but we don't know how. It tells us that there's going to be a heel that's going to be bruised and a head that's going to be crushed. We can go on through the Bible and we can actually find other things like this in the Bible that complement it and go through and basically reinforce this as a common theme. All right? The first one I want to talk about real quick is Pharaoh. When we get to the scripture on Pharaoh, and of course, the Israelites, the plagues happen, they leave Egypt, Pharaoh follows the Israelites and are just about to take them, they cross the Red Sea, and then after Exodus happened, it says the right hand of God shatters the enemy, and in Numbers it says their bones, still talking about the Egyptians, he will break and his arrows will crush. There's a crushing going on. It is parallel to what was being said back when the Chekhov's gun was introduced. It's another hint, it's another clue. When we go a little bit farther into the book of Judges, we find a tyrannical ruler named Abimelech. He was there's an event that's described in Judges chapter 9 where he laid siege to a city. He enters the city and the residents fled into the citadel, but there is a woman that came and solved the problem, and guess how she did it? A certain woman threw an upper millstone up on his head and crushed his skull. Okay? Here again, resolution by the same kind of symbolism that we're getting right from the beginning. Here's another one that should be obvious. It's easy once you see it. 1 Samuel. Israel's afraid of the big giant. All right? All except one boy. He's the seed of Israel. He crushes the head of this Philistine with a seed, who is the seed of Ham, which symbolizes the seed of the serpent. And it says, and David put his hands in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine where? In the forehead. Now we can do all kinds of analysis. Is that's the weak spot? They didn't have anything. That doesn't really matter. The point is he's getting his head crushed. How did the author know all of these things that were going to happen in real life, real time, would coincide with what was introduced back in Genesis chapter 3? The stone sank into his forehead. It crushed it, is basically what it's describing. And he fell on his face on the ground. In Psalms, it simply says this: God will shatter. The Hebrew word there is crush. God will crush the heads of his enemies, the hairy crown of him who walks in his guilty ways. Over and over and over and over again, we see this same theme coming up, reinforcing the original one. So, kind of like the Bible a lot of times, and I may talk about this later, is like a movie, or I'm sorry, like a painting. The painting, when the painter starts, you don't know what it's about. Just laying down little pieces and stuff of what the base would be. If you were to look at that, you would just think it was abstract. But as the painter goes along, there's other things that he puts as elements in there until finally, when the painting is done, you know what it's about. Genesis chapter 3 started us on a journey that lasted throughout the rest of the Bible. And these little hints and clues made it clearer and clearer and clearer until finally one day that Chekhov's gun was fired. When did that happen? Easy peasy. New Testament. When was the Chekhov's? What was the Chekhov's gun? There's a seed that's going to crush. When was it fired?
The cross, right?
The cross. It was fired at the cross. That's when the resolution came. We can't see that if we look at the Bible like we just got done saying at the beginning of this class, as a set of, here's the history books, here's the law books, here's the prophecy books. We have to look at it as a story, or we don't see that going from beginning to end. What happens after the cross? After Chekhov's gun is fired? Things get better. Now there's a way. Now we know how to get back to the main subject, which is God. Now we know that in the end, by the time we get to Revelation chapters 21 and 22, the last two chapters of Revelation, things are going to be better than they were at the beginning. That's the story of the Bible. And it's important to read it that way. Did the Old Testament people understand this? The answer is no. They may have partially understood that there was something going on, but even Daniel himself, writing down prophecies about this promised seed coming, at the end of his book, what does he say? I don't understand. Give me some more information. What did God tell me? Close up the book. It's not time for you to understand yet. All you are is one of my writers to put down the story so that when this promised seed comes, you'll know who it is. But you're not going to be alive when that happens. So we're writing a story not only by 40 authors over a 1,500 year period of time, by people that didn't know each other about all of human history. They didn't understand what it was about, and yet it becomes one story by the time you get to the end. That's impossible unless there's a mastermind, and I think that is extremely good evidence that this book was not written by just merely men. Okay? It says this in Colossians chapter 1, last verse. This was a mystery throughout the entire all of ages, from Adam and Eve on. And Paul puts it this way, that he, talking about Jesus, okay, becomes, it's talking about the church. So Jesus becomes the church servant according to God's commission that was given to me for you, to make the word of God fully known, the mystery that has been hidden throughout the ages and generations, but has now been revealed to the saints. The story was in place for a long time so that the saints, us, could understand and know that this was not only written by God, we now know what was written about, and now we can take part in what God intended from the very beginning to get us back to the end of the story. I find this fascinating. It's like God's painting us a very intricate picture, little by little, throughout the Old Testament, with clues, and all of them point in the same direction. We're going to look at some of those other clues in the next couple of weeks. Any questions?